Think Forward. Think Research Channel.
It is a pleasure this evening to introduce Fred Bemak, who is Director of the Diversity Research and Action Center and Professor of Counseling and Development in the College of Education and Human Development here at George Mason. Professor Bemak came to us from Ohio State University, and previous he's been at Johns Hopkins, University of Massachusetts, and a variety of other places. He is a distinguished scholar in the field of counseling, with 4 books to his credit and a wide range of articles. And his real specialty, although specialty makes it sound unduly narrow, is the combination of his deep interest in counseling and human services with his equally keen interest in cultural diversity and the impact that diversity has on counseling activities. Professor Bemak is also distinguished by the extent to which he puts his service where his mouth is. He has worked in a variety of locations on pressing issues of human need. He will be off to another stint in Myanmar as part of his work in the second semester of this year. He's worked in Myanmar before. He rushed to the Katrina scene shortly after the disaster there. More recently, he and a team of students and others were out in California dealing with some of the mental health impacts of the wildfires there. So this is a person who is a distinguished scholar, a tireless worker for mental health, and he'll be talking to us this evening about issues with contemporary youth. Professor Bemak.
Good evening. I'm very pleased to be here tonight to talk to you about a generation in jeopardy, today's youth, tomorrow's future. I've been working with youth for the past 4 decades, and it's given me some cause for observation about what's going on with youth and some thoughts about what's happening with youth. And tonight, what I'd like to talk to you about are several things, just to share with you the state of the art with what's going on with youth, talk about some of my reflections about these 4 decades of work, and speak about some of the major issues that I think impact youth today. Issues like poverty and early childhood, health disparities that are going on, education delinquency, what's going on with these issues, race and ethnicity and racism and the impact on youth, homelessness, technology, and a little bit about youth in a global context, just to give you a kind of picture of where youth are today. And then I'd like to share with you some of the projects that I have been working on over these past number of years that are pathways for hope and future for the next generation. So it's a lot to cover, and I'm going to try to cover that in the next 50 minutes. My career began, as I said, 4 decades ago, as a summer counselor in Upward Bound. Upward Bound, not Outward Bound. I wasn't rock climbing. It's Upward Bound, John F. Kennedy's War on Poverty, where Upward Bound and Head Start programs were founded. And I began as a summer counselor. A number of years later, I wound up as director of that particular program, that Upward Bound program, federal program. And following that Upward Bound program, I went on to direct in Massachusetts what was called the Regional Adolescent Treatment Program for what was called, they were called untreatable kids. What a name and a label to have. And that was my program. If they could go anywhere else, they would go to that other program, not mine. Those 2 experiences laid the foundation for everything I've been doing with youth and really created a basis. When I thought about coming and sharing with you tonight and talking with you tonight, I thought, how can I start to frame these 4 decades of work? How can I share some of this? And what I'd like to do is start out with some of the questions I have about the youth of today. And I'll just share those with you, maybe to begin to frame some of this and stimulate some thinking on your part, lay a foundation for our time together tonight. First question that I have is, why are youth today so angry? Why are some of the youth so angry? Another question comes from an experience that happened in my neighborhood recently. A young child was on a bicycle, riding along on the bike, fell down, scraped her knee, was crying. I went over to help her out, to pick her up, and she looked at me with tremendous fear, and that fear superseded the scrape on her knee and the pain that she had, and she was nervous with me. Why is that so? That children are afraid of us? Adults afraid of others? Why is it that youth don't care about their schools and communities and their environment? There's $600 million a year in school vandalism. Why is it that youth are doing this? Some youth, not all, some. Why is it that I'm struck about something about school buses? Let me share this with you. Another question I have. I was driving today, saw another school bus. School buses. Doesn't happen like this in other countries, but those yellow buses, they're driving, red lights are flashing, the bus stops, and children get off, they saunter off the bus and just walk across the street, never looking, never thinking about what's around them. What are the implications for children to think that there's no interaction with the environment they're in, there's no concern, and the world simply stops for them when they step off a bus? Other countries don't do that. Why is it so difficult to get youth to stop text messaging and pay attention to me or to you? What's the desperate need for connection? What's that about? And why? And how did respect become such a huge issue? People are getting hurt about not respecting other kids, one child to another, one youth to another. And how did we come to a point in our society when the parents of children are looking at other adults with tremendous mistrust and fear as well? A group of children are playing, they're kicking a ball, the ball comes my way, I take it up, throw it back, make a nice comment. Parents are looking at me, what does he want? What is he doing? It doesn't happen like that in other places. And how did bullying become such a large issue? How come there's so many children that seem to be victims or perpetrators of bullying? These are the questions I've been thinking about. And why are kids more self-centered than ever? Are we creating a generation of narcissistic tyrants? What's going on? And what's that about? One of my colleagues at Johns Hopkins University, a well-known colleague in psychiatry, said to me one day, I really feel sad for the youth, for the next generation. I said, why? What's that about? She said, well, the children, they don't have time to just put their head on the grass, to just kind of float around, to daydream about things. These kids don't have that opportunity. What happened to daydreaming? And what are the implications about kids not being able to do that nowadays? And why is it when I'm walking down, it's a true story, walking down the hallway with a principal in an inner city school, why is it that the principal looks over and sees a couple of kids in an altercation? He said, unless there's blood, it's not serious. Why is that happening in our schools? And how is it that we're blurring reality and fantasy for kids of today? These TV shows, these reality TV shows that teach certain messages about intimacy and about how you find a partner for life and about how relationships are formed. This blurring of reality for children leaves me wondering what's going to happen to these kids. And how did sound bites become more important than substance? What's going on with that? And in terms of personal space, why is it now an insult if you accidentally brush a shoulder or if you're looking directly at someone? How did that become an insult in our world? And lastly, last question is, let me talk about Thomas for a second. Thomas was child, 9-year-old child living in a city, And I was talking with Thomas one day, and Thomas said, my mom, she won't let me sit in the parlor, in the front parlor. And I said, why not? What is that about, Thomas? And Thomas shared with me, well, out on the street there are shootings. And twice there have been bullets that have come through my windows, our windows. I can't sit in the front parlor anymore. What's Thomas going to be like? He's 9 now. What will he be like when he's 18 years old? These questions all lead me to some general reflections, and I want to share the reflections with you, and then I want to talk about some of the statistics about where our youth are today. Let me start with some of the reflections. The reflections that I'm thinking about in terms of where we are, four decades of this, are what about today and yesterday? I'm concerned that the youth of today compared to yesterday are different. I don't get 100% consensus on very much, but whenever I ask a teacher or someone working with youth in social services, juvenile services, whenever I ask them, how are the youth of today compared to yesterday? Everybody says they're different. It's 100% consensus that I've seen. Responsibility. I don't blame our children for what's going on today. I blame our culture, our society, for what we are doing and what we are not doing. And in terms of short and long-term impact, I wonder what the impact is on civil society with what we're doing with youth today. What about good citizenship and community building and care for our environment and personal and social development? What about that? And what are going to be the long-range implications of that? By the way, this young child who's sitting there reflecting on these issues, whose picture happens to be me. And I thought, where did I start, and what are some of the reflections I have? And I wasn't obviously reflecting on these issues, but I was coming into these issues in the future. And in terms of what to do, many parents and teachers that I run into talk to me and say, I don't know what to do. I don't know what to do with my child. I'm not sure where to go. I'm reminded of a boy that I was working with at one point in time named Craig. And Craig was a very angry young man. And Craig was threatening his parents. And he was describing to me in detail how he wanted to, it was very painful to hear, how he wanted to shoot his mother. And he gave me graphic detail about what would happen, the blood, the guts, the gore. It was awful. I felt like I was inside a video game listening to his description, and I don't know if he understood it. But that's on an extreme in the continuum in terms of what happens with children. But his parents didn't know what to do with him. Many parents don't know what to do with their children, and they're at a loss. So we have children being shaped by music and television and internet rather than by parents, because one is they don't know how to do it sometimes, and two is they don't have the time or commitment or energy necessary in today's world. Role models. Many of us are doing wonderful jobs as role models. Some of us aren't. And some of us have fallen short. What's happened to honesty and integrity and respect for others and self-control and giving back to the community? Why is it we're seeing adults fighting at 10-year-old sports events with coaches or with each other? Why is it that their child's in the back seat and their mother or father in the front is driving in a mode of road rage? Why is it that our politicians and leaders, and sometimes our civil servants, are stealing and lying and cheating, and there's some message there, if we can get away with it, it might be okay. Let me say something about punishment and control. I think we're more and more in a mindset about moving towards punishing children and controlling children. We have 48 states right now that have waived laws permitting juveniles to become tried as adult offenders. Whenever I hear, when I watch the news, I don't know how it is for you, when I watch the news, I see quite often when something happens, like a fire is accidentally started or in a house, or someone is pushed off a balcony, awful things that happen, there's always an associated statement saying, and this child, there are no charges filed, or there are charges filed. Something about we're moving away from nurturance and guidance and mentoring, in my opinion, and we're moving much more into blame and penalties. How is it that our principals who used to solve things in their office now have police walking through hallways in many schools? And those behaviors that were resolved just sitting in an office are now criminalized behaviors. We also have an emphasis on interventions, not prevention, right now. And I would suggest to you that the priorities and the emphasis that we have focuses on what are we doing to intervene, and we're losing the preventative mode. Here, I have a different picture than there. Okay, so I'm going to no, I'm not. Okay, the emphasis on intervention, not prevention. Where one school I was at, the principal came every day to the school. I was consulting at the school. Principal came every single day, 45 minutes early, and picked up the needles around the school. Why aren't we working with preventing the need and the use and the abuse of drugs so that these elementary school kids and this principal didn't include that in her job description? Poverty, social, political, and economic disparities. This child is me, growing a little bit, still reflecting and moving into my childhood and adolescence. That the problems with youth, all the research says poverty and problems with youth have a very strong relationship. And I'm going to talk about poverty and share with you some of the facts today in terms of poverty. Fundamentally, what I would say is the U.S. is not a playing field. It's not a level playing field for all children. And the U.S. has not provided value and protection and opportunity equally for all students. Connectedness and belonging. I think this is critical, and I see children at all ages with a huge need to connect to each other. We live in an individualistic culture, and in this culture, in the United States, in this culture, our aims are towards personal goals or towards self-development, individuation, self-reliance, self-esteem, independence, self-indulgence, personal ownership, etc. Collectivistic cultures, which, by the way, are 70% of the world's population, comes from collectivistic cultures. We're in the minority in terms of the kind of culture we're in. Collectivistic cultures look at family and community first. Look at loyalty, dependence, harmony, obligation, reciprocity, give and take. And an example comes to mind by thinking of my recent trips to Myanmar. In Myanmar, a fascinating thing that I observed. I usually like to bring something when I'm working with kids, and I talk with many, many, many kids in Myanmar. And what I brought this time was Tootsie Roll lollipops, something they'd never seen. And I was out in very remote areas sometimes working with children, and the children had never seen anything like that, although I think, having worked in many countries, sugar is sugar is sugar. But still, they'd not seen something like these lollipops. And as my colleague Rita Chi-Ying Chung and I were working there, another faculty member here at George Mason, as we were working there and handing out the lollipops, we saw something very interesting. The children would unwrap the lollipops, take 1 or 2 licks, and then wrap them back up. And I was wondering, don't they like them? What's going on? Here's what was going on. I asked them, why aren't you eating them? And they said, we're saving them till we get home to share with our brothers and sisters and friends. Incredible, touching experience. These children had a sense of belonging. So I think it's important, belonging and connection for children. And we don't have enough of that, particularly in this time of internet, and particularly in this time where kids are more and more isolated. Recognition. I feel like, in my experience with children, that they need tremendous amounts of recognition. Now, I come from a generation where Andy Warhol, some of you may remember him, was around, and he said, well, everybody should have 15 minutes of fame. Well, I've translated that in my own mind to 2007, saying, well, we're not all going to get 15 minutes of fame, but 15 seconds of recognition is pretty important. So when I'm working with kids nowadays, and when I see Lily or Jamal or Juan or Steve, when I'm working with these kids, and I say, Lily, how did it go last week when you went to talk to your mom? Jamal, what happened with that teacher you were trying to work it out with because she was yelling a lot at you? And Juan, how's it going? Did you work those things out with your friends? There are two things that happen. I can't tell you how many times I've seen this. The children's eyes light up. One is I remember their name. And two, they light up because I remember what happened for them. And I ask them. And it's profound, this level of recognition. Our lack of attention to children concerns me a great deal. But let me trace back to roots for a second with you and where some of our values come from. And I always like to go and see, what are the origins of things? And I want to go back to 1715 with you for a second. Rules for proper behavior from English guides aimed to assist parents to teach children about their places. And let me just, I took a few excerpts. I thought it was interesting to kind of bring back some of these. First one, make a bow always when you come home and be immediately uncovered. Remove headgear. In today's world, that means hooded sweatshirts and hats and caps. 2, if thou art going to speak to thy parents and see them engaged in discourse with company, draw back and leave thy business until afterwards. But if thou must speak, be sure to whisper. 3, never speak to thy parents without some title of respect, sir, madame, etc. 4, dispute not nor delay to obey thy parents' commands. I'm sure that happens with many of you. 5, go not out of doors without thy parents' leave, and return within the time by them limited. Today's world called curfew. There are many disagreements about curfews. 6, quarrel not nor contend with thy brethren or sisters, but live in love, peace, and unity. Many of your dinner tables may not experience that or may experience that. 7, grumble not nor be discontented at anything thy parents appoint, speak, or do. There you go. Bring them home. Share them with your children. 8, last one that I want to share with you. There are a number of them, but I thought it was interesting to trace back. Bear with meekness and patience, and without murmuring or sullenness, thy parents' reproofs or corrections. Take criticism. Welcome criticism. We've had a number of problems. We've had many children consuming alcohol. This is the late 1700s to 1900s. We had youth crusades to rescue children, youth rescuing other children from alcohol. We had serious heroin addiction among youth in the early 1900s. In 1940, 49% of all youth did not finish high school. We had a 51% graduation rate in 1940. Today, there are 64.5 million children in the U.S., 21% of the population. Let me talk a little bit about some of the issues I mentioned before. In 2006, there were 13 million children who were poor. From 2000 to 2006, there was an 11% increase in poverty of children. Increase. We are on the uprise in terms of kids who are poor in the United States. District of Columbia has the highest rate in the country, at least in 2006 it did. 1 out of 3 children are poor in District of Columbia. These figures are just daunting when I hear them. We also know that the greater the poverty level, the lower the academic performance. And there are many, many reasons for that in terms of schools and structure and services and resources. But the greater the poverty, the less the academic performance. African American and Latino children are disproportionately poor. From 2000 to 2005, the number of black children living in extreme poverty increased by 22%. That's alarming. But even more so for Hispanic children, in extreme poverty increased by 45%. Here are the facts of what's going on, the data. In 2005, 30% of black and 24% of Latino children lived in families that were hungry or at risk of hunger. When I was out in San Diego recently, working with the fires and working with a number of migrant families, immigrant families, over and over and over again, I heard the fathers of these families and the mothers of these families say to me, one after the other, every day I wake up and I don't know if I'll be able to feed my family today. Every day I heard that. Poverty and youth. We could address poverty. I'm amazed at how we've mobilized for a war, but we haven't mobilized for poverty. It's a choice, it's a policy, it's a resource decision, and we haven't done it. Let me go on to health disparities for a second. We're the richest nation on earth, and we're actually increasing the number of uninsured children in the United States, and they're not getting the critical health care that they need. 2006, the number of uninsured children rose for the second year in a row. There are more than 9 million uninsured children in the United States right now. Among the industrialized nations, we rank 22nd in low birth weight babies. It's been increasing steadily since 1984. Child at low birth weight, the reason this is important in terms of child's development, is because we know that they're likely to score less in math and science and other areas. There's research that points to this very, very clearly. Black children are 69% more likely than white children to be uninsured. Latino children are more than 3 times less likely than white children to have health insurance. 90% of the 9 million uninsured children live in working families and a majority in 2-parent families. And if you look at the minimum wage and the economics, a minimum wage job, if you're working full-time, pays only 59%. 59% of the federal poverty level for a family of 4. 34% of 9, just to give you a sense of the state of the art. There's not time to go through any of one of these. We could go through at length for quite a long time. 34% of 9th graders, 61% of 12th graders report having sexual intercourse. 7% of high school students report that they had sexual intercourse by the age of 13. 750,000 teenage girls get pregnant every year, twice the rate of Great Britain, 9 times the rate of the Netherlands and Japan. We spend $7 billion a year to help families who've experienced a teenage birth. 1 in 6 teens is a current alcohol user. 1 in 10 reported that they are binge drinkers. 2004, the national public school graduation rate was 69%. 69% of our students are graduating. 31% are not graduating. You see the breakdown here in terms of Asians, whites, American Indians, African Americans, and Hispanics. And please put a human face on this, because I'm seeing, when I see these figures, I'm seeing Penny and I'm seeing Diego, I'm seeing Sam, Khalil, Terrence, Sue. I'm seeing faces of people. And I know if I'm sitting there with Diego, I know that he only has 1 out of 2 chance to graduate from school. Let me say something about policies. Zero tolerance, mandatory expulsion, suspensions. We know from research that suspensions and expulsion, mandatory expulsion, zero tolerance is not working. Results have showed in all cases that these kinds of policies do not create behavioral change and do not improve academic performance. They just don't. And in fact, there's a correlation, a very clear correlation, with higher rates of suspension are associated with less academic performance. Back to San Diego for a second. When I was in the in-school suspension room after the fires, many kids were acting out because they had lost their homes, their loved ones, their pets. And when I was in the in-school suspension room with 30 kids in high school, it was It was incredible. They were throwing things at each other. They were acting out. They were yelling. They were swearing. They were pushing each other. There was nothing in terms of learning happening in that room to help them transition back to their classes and help them improve and deal with what they had. We also know that school size, that the larger the school, the more problems in the school. I've got to say something about medication and youth. We use more medication than any other country in the world with our youth. We use 90% of the world's Ritalin. 90%. In 1999 to 2001, a seminal study, a major study that's referred to all the time in terms of medication, there was a 250% increase in the use of psychotropic medications given to U.S. Youth. 2006, a 10-month study in the Michigan Medicaid Commission had a 10-month study, 100% increase in 10 months in the use of mood stabilizers, 45% increase in antipsychotic drugs. I'm afraid we're creating a generation of zombies for those children that are struggling in our society and having a difficult time. Lawrence Steinberg, professor, said at Temple University, the juvenile justice system has become the dumping ground for poor minority kids with mental health and special education problems. When you look at the figures on what we spend, it's alarming. We spend 3 times as much for prisoners as we do for public school pupils. For prisoners as compared to public school pupils, it costs much more to detain a child than to provide him or her with Head Start. It costs about $7,000 a year for Head Start. It costs over $22,000, $23,000 a year to incarcerate somebody. Studies have reported that 75% of incarcerated youth have severe mental disorders and 20% have a severe disorder. 75% have mental health disorders. Latino children have the highest percentage of unmet needs. We are not culturally responding to the needs of different cultural groups in our country adequately, particularly in terms of services to children. Hate crimes in the U.S. have gone up by 8%. The Washington Post ran a piece on this recently. 11% of the students between 12 and 18 reported someone at school had used hate-related words against them. 38% had seen hate-related graffiti. There's a clear relationship in the research and the literature about a correlation between racism and mental health, how youth are. Almost 2 million children run away or are thrown out of their homes every year. 2 million in the United States. On any given night, 200,000 children are homeless. They're very similar to the children I work with in Brazil, the street kids. I've done work with street children there, and they're very similar kinds of issues. We just don't call them street children. We call them homeless in the United States. I've got to say something about technology. Home computer use, internet access is very clearly correlated with better academic performance. And yet there's a downside to it. 42% of youth have been bullied online, 35%, 1 out of 3 has been threatened online. Mean and hurtful things have been said to 58% of the youth online. Over half of them never even told an adult about it. And if you can see this slide, on this texting, it says, "Hey, idiot." And that's pretty typical for some of the things that go on. I have taught a class talking about youth at risk, and it's one of those other things that have 100% agreement. One of the assignments I give my students is to go out into internet and see where youth are hanging out. And people have gone to very benign sites where cooking or sharing recipes, and inevitably, graduate students wind up finding a place on the internet where there's pornography, where there's violence, where there's abuse, and 100% of the students come back from that assignment saying, "I will never let my child on internet without supervision." So there's a downside to what's going on with technology as well. One thing about education comparatively, across the board with other, there are many comparisons internationally. I want to just share one with you and then talk about some of the projects I've been doing. 15-year-old children comparisons from 1999 to 2003 in terms of reading, math, and science. In 1999, we were in the middle of the pack in relationship to 29 participating countries, developed countries, industrialized countries. Everything, all of those subject areas have been going down. We're at the lower end of the pack of the group by 2003 in terms of what we're doing. Building hope and future, pathways. Let me share a little bit about some, I think these statistics are more to say, here is the state of the art, it's not all roses. And I have tremendous hope about, but I think we have to do some things. And we have to continue to do things and change some things that we're doing. And so this is based on, these are some of the projects I've developed and some of the work I've been doing, and it's a culmination of this 4 decades. The connections with family and group. I talked about this before. The connections, kids are desperate for a connection, particularly in this time of isolation in our society. Example is I went into a middle school and I had a grant, a project, where I worked with kids who were not attending. I said, why don't you let me try to work with the kids who aren't attending school? The school had tried many, many different interventions. They tried giving the kids alarm clocks, which the kids thought was funny. They tried calling the parents at home. They tried doing wake-up calls. They tried behavior modification programs. Nothing had worked. These middle school kids still were not coming to school. I went in and started a group. And at first, there were only 4 or 5 kids there. They gave me 10 names because the other kids were absent. And the 4 or 5 kids I sat down and worked with, and I said to them, how you doing? What's happening? And they looked at me a little puzzled and said, what do you mean, what's happening? And what surprised them was they shared with me, we've been told what to do over and over and over again. People keep telling us what to do. They tell us we're bad kids. They tell us we're not doing right. They tell us we should come to school. Nobody's asked how you're doing. And of course, the issues that started to come out as we began to talk were fascinating. The issues were pressure about sex from older kids. The issues were pressures about drinking, pressures about alcohol, problems in the home. And they didn't have anywhere else to talk about it. And as they felt like they began to connect with others and share with others, they told their peers, and we went with all 10 kids and they all came, and they started to come not only on the Wednesday that we met, but they started to come on Tuesday and Thursday and eventually the other days. They felt a connection, and then they started to come. I've done this kind of project over and over again. Family involvement. Another school, another state. I worked with a number of families. I went into another middle school and asked this particular school, asked them about who are the kids that are failing, and who are the kids that are failing whose parents are disengaged and not coming into school and not responding to phone calls, not participating with you. And they gave me the names, kind of smiling a little, well, you'll never get these parents. We've been trying for a couple of years. And I started calling. It took me about 2 months to get 3 or 4 parents in. I was trying to call about 8 or 9. And I brought them in, and we started to talk about whether or not they were interested in helping their children and some of their struggles as parents. And what evolved from that was fascinating, because they started to feel, again, that connection. They started to feel family connection. And they started to call the other parents, say, this is important, you should come in. We had, within 2 months, we had a waiting list to get into that program. And they were actually interviewing so the other parents to decide who would come in and who wouldn't. We had a waiting list to come into that program. I think the connection with parents is critical. We had kids in one room being tutored, parents in another talking about difficulties parenting. We'd bring the 2 of them together for community meetings sometimes. It was powerful. And we had kids trying to get into the program as well as parents. Our schools are not parent-friendly, family-friendly, grandmother-friendly. We don't have space and room for families, and yet we say and welcome families to come in. Modeling trust and respect. I think we have to walk the walk and we talk the talk. I don't see a lot of, I see sometimes work with kids where we're contradicting what we're telling them to do. And I think it's very important that we start to do and preach and say and act in this consistent ways. Self-esteem trap. I know there are several of my students here in the audience. You've heard me say this before. This is really quite unpopular, but I'm not really a proponent of self-esteem. And let me tell you what I mean by that. I think we're facilitating and cultivating shallow self-esteem, where we're having people look in mirrors and say they feel better, and kids, and say that they're feeling more hopeful and good. And then they go out from these kind of intensive, supportive encounters, and they still fail at tests. They still don't know how to have social skills to be with friends. They don't know how to work with and talk with their parents at home, where they're having difficulties with. They don't know how to deal with teachers that have been riding them and on their case. So I really think we need to teach people and help people be successful at what they're doing, and the self-esteem will come along. I think it goes hand in hand. And I think it's a huge bandwagon right now that I think is falling short. A couple more and then I'll stop for the evening. I think programs have to have relevance and meaning for youth. Let me share with you what I mean by that. Another project that I did in high school. I went to a city and was working with the superintendent, and I said, what's the high school with the worst academic performance record? And the superintendent told me, here's the high school. I said, okay. Went to the principal in the school and said, who are the students that are at highest risk of failure and of dropping out in your high school? And the principal shared with me very quickly, here are 8 girls. And so I brought the girls together, and the same kind of intervention, they've been harassed, they've been harangued about doing better, about doing good work, about coming to school. And I sat with those children and talked about what's going on in your life, what's happening. And they sat together and they started to share, and they had nowhere else in their life, the same scenario over and over again, nowhere else in their life to share that. It was touching, because what happened soon after was, as we approached Christmas, this is what they said. They said, can we meet on Christmas? We're like a family. This is really our family. And it was touching, because they wanted to come on Christmas Day, they wanted to meet. It's profound. The sense of what has relevance and meaning and what has connection. Realistic goals. I see so much work with children that aren't realistic. A child comes in who's angry, and the message is, you have to stop being angry. Well, they can't stop being angry. We have to look at very successful short-term goals and how we begin to work with children to improve, and appreciate that they will be angry, but hopefully as we work with them, they'll be less angry, and that the problems will start to diminish. The unrealistic expectations perpetuates a cycle of failure for many of our youth. And those children wind up dropping out of our system, and we're losing them dramatically. Win-win. I think it's critical that I see so many children who come to me, and so many adults who get into power struggles with those children, particularly obstinate children or difficult children. And I think a lot of children are losing right now, particularly those with problems. And so whenever I'm working with children, I keep thinking, how can they win and how can I win? How can we both win? I don't want to win a power struggle with a child and have them continue and perpetuate their failure. There are many examples, so I don't have time tonight, but many examples about where that is and how to do that. And connecting the past, present, and future. These last two, and then I'm going to end for tonight. I think we have to not get stuck in the past when we're working with children, and figure out, how does the past, how does where you've been, how does your life and the history of your life affect who you are today? And then I think we have to take that and connect it with the future. There's interesting research in psychology, outcome research, that talks about positive outcome for counseling and therapy. And one of the factors that this outcome research has found is 15% of the outcome, of a positive outcome, is about hope. Well, I would say with kids who are struggling, kids who are really in difficult times, that we have to triple that we have to talk about outcomes with children, 45%. 45% is about hope. How many children have you seen who say, I don't know if I'll be around in a year. I don't know how long I'll be here. So how do we begin to work with these children to perpetuate and instill a sense of hope in future? Refreshing. The last one. Let me say something about refreshing. In California, there was a young man, Brian, who had lost, the young boy really, who had lost his home, had everything wiped out, lost his pet in the fire, lost his house, had nothing left. And he came in, he was talking to one of my students who might be here, I don't know, and myself, and he was talking about, we were sitting with him, and it was the first time he'd ever shared what had happened in terms of all his loss and how painful it was. At the end of our conversation, this young boy looked up and said, "This is so refreshing." And my sense was, we need more refreshings. And that's what the refreshing is. Let me end with two quotes. One from Frederick, let me come back to this. Next generation, this happens to be me with the my next generation coming along. And I think that, and it's just a metaphor, each of us have our own pictures for this. Frederick Douglass, I'm going to change the gender in this to make it, to have it be bias-free when I read these two quotes. Frederick Douglass said, it is easier to build strong children than to fix broken men and women. I think our investment has to be with children. It's hard to fix broken adults. And the last quote, Gabriela Mistral, a Chilean poet, Nobel Prize winner, said, "We are guilty of many errors and many faults, but our worst crime is abandoning the children, neglecting the fountain of life. Many of the things we need can wait. The child cannot. Right now is the time. His or her bones are being formed. His or her blood is being made. And his or her senses are being developed. To him or her, we cannot answer tomorrow. His name, her name is today." Thank you.